How do you reach across the aisle when you're not seen as human? Often we talk about bridging the gap between the left and the right, reaching across the aisle and welcoming people into our leftist spaces. And I'm glad some people can do that, but I am not in the demographic that can do that because I'm trans. Whenever I do attempt to reach across the aisle to conservatives, to people on the right, I am often not treated as human, and it's because they don't see me as human. I am seen as other. I'm seen as an ideology to pwn. Why would they listen to me speak when they inherently disagree with my aliveness? They disagree with my existence. So nothing I can say or do will convince them to do anything. So the idea of reaching across the aisle falls onto people who are seen as human by the right, which for all intents and purposes are white cishet people, typically men, but white women do have access to communicative privilege. But I also know I cannot sit quietly and just let people who are not trans speak for me, a trans person, because sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're very wrong, and sometimes even people on the left can be deeply transphobic. And that's not even to mention the racism problem we have on the left. I'm just going to pin that in the corner. We'll come back to that in like a few weeks or something when I feel the urge to cause a problem. So how do I reach across the aisle? How do I do that as a trans person? I mainly do that by not shutting the fuck up. I never sit quietly. I always ensure I take up space, especially in spaces that don't want me. I make sure to assert myself. Obviously, I put my safety first, but for example, I go to college in the Deep South, and when the conversation arises, I make sure people know that I am trans. And I make sure people know that my opinions come from that of being trans. I also, personally, feel comfortable answering questions to cis people. When cis people ask weird questions, invasive questions about my surgeries, my hormones, my genitals, my lifestyle, whatever, I feel comfortable answering that because I know that I am a sex positive person that loves my body. And so I love to talk about it. I love to talk about my sex and I love to talk about my body. And that means that if I can take this L, if I talk about my sex and my body, it means that this cis person isn't going to go bother a trans person who isn't comfortable with that. They're not going to go bother other people because they got their literal invasive answer from me who's willing to have that conversation. So I reach across the aisle by one, taking up space, and two, allowing myself to be proud and open about what makes me me, because that kind of gets the weirdness out of some cis people's systems. And the third thing I do to reach across the aisle is that I know when to pick my battles. So many cis people don't view trans people as human. So many of them. But some of those cis people do it out of ignorance, and some of those cis people do it out of malice. And with enough practice, you'll be able to tell which is which. And you'll learn that malice is never worth engaging with. If someone's never going to talk to you in good faith, it is not worth your time. It's not worth your energy. You're never going to convince them to see you as human. You're never going to convince them that you are worth the activism, the time, the energy, the empathy, any of it. But ignorance, uneducation, miseducation, disinformation, these things can be engaged with if the person you're talking to is willing to learn. And yes, the people willing to learn are fewer and farther between than the people that do not view you as human. It is sad, but it is true. But when you find the people who are willing to learn, it kind of makes it all worth it. It really does. And it's interesting, too, because you learn the lines that cis people draw when it comes to education, and when you start to learn their patterns, you can use their patterns against them. All in all, the concept of reaching across the aisle is harder and more laborious than people think it is, and most of the time it's not worth it. But when it is worth it, when you find the times it's worth it, it can be very rewarding. But again, how do you do that with people who don't see you as human? It's hard, and it's risky. If you are cis, try to stand up for trans people more in spaces, and try to make it where we have to do a lot less reaching across the aisle. And if you're trans, learn your emotional stamina. Figure out what you can and cannot do. Figure out what conversations you can and cannot have for your safety and your emotional risk. Know yourself and know what you can do, and just do what you can. It's always worth it to just do what you can. Believe it or not, this podcast is one of my attempts of reaching across the aisle, if you care to believe it. Because also, you don't have to be morally perfect to reach across the aisle. You just have to speak your truth and hope your truth resonates. You don't have to be nice. You don't have to be kind. You don't have to be education worthy, like teacher certified, whatever the hell. You just have to be authentically trans and hope that that resonates with someone.